Welcome everyone to the Pilot Record Database webinar. Please be aware that your mics and cameras are disabled by default. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to now announce today's facilitator, Chris Morris. Mr. Morris, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Vince. Appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. Super glad that you guys could join us today for another PRD webinar. This one is going to have a lot of content. We hope to resolve some frequent questions and then also show you some of this process. But certainly a lot to cover. I'm a little concerned that we may not have a lot of time at the end for questions. I hope to still create some of that time because I think that's really useful. But I can't promise it. We'll see how it goes. We're going to try real hard to respect our 1 hour time reservation. But let's go ahead and get started, and we'll cover a couple of housekeeping things. So this slide, of course, just shows you who's on the PRD team. Of course, my name is Chris Morris. I'm the PRD program manager. We also have on the call with us Stacy Smith. She is the assistant PRD program manager. And then we have the PRD support team, who's also here assisting during the webinar. Like Vince already mentioned, if you have any questions, we'd like you to use the Q&A box provided with the webinar software. And some of the PRD support folks will be trying to address some of those questions during the actual webinar. If the questions are more complex or you need some research, that sort of thing, we may not answer it today during the webinar. If that happens, then we will respond to your question by email. I do have to say we normally respond within about a week-ish to these webinar questions. It may be a little bit longer than that because of some scheduling conflicts coming up in the next 2 weeks or so. So if you do submit a question and you don't get it answered today, I ask you to please be patient with us. While we process these, just dealing with some other commitments going on the next couple of weeks. So, but we'll do our best to get those sorted right away. This presentation will be available at prd.fa.gov. And what I mean by that is we will have the slides posted. Usually that comes a couple of weeks after the presentation or so. We get the slides posted. And then also, and usually quicker than that, you will see a recorded version of this webinar. So you could actually, rewatch the webinar if you wanted to see something, or maybe if you know folks that couldn't attend, right? You could send that to them. So this will be available to you that way. So what we're going to cover today, originally in the design stage for this presentation, it was meant to be more of a technical discussion of how do you request records via the PRD system, but it ends up being more of a policy discussion. But I think that's fine. It's hopefully we'll answer questions that those of you here that review records in the PRD system, maybe you've been kind of looking for. So we're going to discuss why do you even have to request records in the PRD system? Why is that even a thing? So we'll cover that. And then we'll go into how do you figure out if you need to use the record request function in PRD, because there's some situations where you don't need to do it. So we'll go into that. And then, of course, the technical piece of, well, how do you actually use the record request function? This is probably the shortest part of the webinar because it's really pretty straightforward, really very simple. It's like 2 clicks and you get it done. So, and then, of course, if you request additional records be entered to the PRD, you need to make sure that you can view those clearly once they get updated. So we'll talk about that because there's a couple little things that's really important that you have in mind. So I have this slide here, spoiler alert, because I just wanted to point this out right away. You're gonna discover this because we try to hit this over and over in our discussion today, that right now you need to continue sending FAA form 8060-11 and 11A to previous employers. So if you've already been doing that, that's perfect. That's wonderful. If you were confused as to whether do I still need to do the -11 because we have PRD, that's what this presentation is about. We're going to address those differences and why right now you need to keep sending that -11, 11A. I think for simplicity, it really is the easiest way to move forward during this transition that we're in right now, this transition from PRIA to PRD. So, so that's the spoiler, which you're going to hear multiple times today. So that'll happen until September 9th, 2024. And the other thing I want to mention, just so it's clear, we're going to talk a lot about sending 8060-11 to previous employers. And I'm not going to talk much about the other PREA forms like the -12 and the -13. That's the drug and alcohol request and the NDR request, those things. I'm not going to really talk about those, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to mess with those, because you still may. Those have other requirements. Okay, so we're just focusing on the 11 and the 11A for this discussion. So I just didn't want to give you the wrong impression that because I don't ever really mention the other forms that those are not in play. Of course, you already know that the -10 was discontinued in December, almost a year ago, believe it or not. So, I mean, it's September, it's almost a year. Anyway, so we kind of get that out of the way. So let's talk about kind of, from a policy position, why do you even need to request these pilot records? Why aren't they in PRD already? We have Part 111, we have PRD. Why aren't the records there? So I kind of want to explain that just so it's clear, so you can kind of see this transition that we're going through. So historical pilot records are not due in PRD until, in some cases, June of 23. And then in some other cases, September of 24. It's kind of a multi-staged deadline for historical pilot records. And so because of this multi-stage deadline, it means that until these deadlines arrive, these records may not be in PRD. So, the agency created this staged deadline to give folks time to report what in some cases is thousands and thousands of pilot records. So, so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. And if you're wondering, well, what's a historical record? Just a reminder, historical records are any pilot records dated before June 10th. That's kind of a simplification of it, but that's just a good thing for you to keep in mind, that when I say historical records, that's what I mean. Okay. And then another reason that you even have to ask for records is because some operators, what we call the PAC group, are allowed to delay reporting new records until there's actually a request for those records. So, and that goes on well into the future. That goes on beyond September 2024. So this PAC group, which we'll talk about more in just a little bit, we'll make sure we define it so that you have an idea what we're talking about. These folks, you'll have to conceivably request records from them years into the future, right? Because they're allowed to not report stuff and just kind of hold on to it and then report it if a request comes in. So, okay. Oh, and there's an important point here there at the bottom of that last bullet. Almost didn't say it out loud. This PAC group, they don't report historical records at all to PRD. So again, that's records before June 10th. So the PAC group, they're not going to ever report records before June 10th to PRD. And the only way for you guys to get those records when you're hiring a pilot is via the 8060-11. That's another reason the -11 is sticking around until 2024. Anyway, so let's move on a little bit. Of course, the goal with requesting records is so that you have all of the information that you need to make an informed hiring decision, right? So this whole process is about making sure that records aren't slipping through the cracks during this transition. We got to make sure that even though there's this period where some records are in PRD, some are not, and that gets to be quite a complicated mess, that you still have access to all of the information. It's just some of it may come through PREA, some of it may come through PRD. So once we get to September of 2024, PRD will contain all of the historical pilot records. That's per Part 111. So all those historical records should be there then. And that'll really simplify all of our lives once the transition is behind us. And it makes this requesting records thing much easier. And then what we call new pilot records, which are generally speaking, records dated after June 10th of this year. Those are reported within 30 days automatically. So every 30 days, those are due. So So you shouldn't, as a reviewing entity, as someone that's hiring a pilot, you shouldn't have much delay getting new pilot records because they're required to be reported within 30 days. So, but for now, because we're in this transition, it's really important that you continue requesting records from all the previous employers when you're onboarding. That's the last 5 years, right? The last 5 years, aviation employers, that you continue requesting via the 8060-11 and 11A. If you're wondering why does Chris keep saying 11 and 11A, it's because, you know, those are technically like a pair. They kind of go together, you know. And the AC actually instructs previous employers that they should only process it if they get both the 11 and 11A. So you just want to make sure that you're sending both of those when you send your request. So there are two methods for requesting records. Okay, you already know this one. It's the PRIA form, the 8060-11, 11A, right? We've had it since 1996, 1997. And this method continues to be the primary method. And I say that because that's really the method that you should just lead with that one. And in my opinion, there are some small exceptions where you really don't have to, but I think they're so hard to sort out. It's just easier. It's easier on you just to say, I'm going to send the -11 and 11A to all the previous 5 years employers, like you've done for years, right? You've done it this way for a super long time. And then the other method for requesting pilot records is via the PRD application. And of course, that's what we're going to show you today, is kind of how that works. And then come September 2024, our transition will be over and PRIA will go away, meaning you will no longer have access to the 8060-11, 11A. You won't need it anymore. And you'll use just the PRD system to look at records and to request records, and really what we think should be a pretty limited instances. So I want to cover, you know, kind of how you can expect the records to come back to you if you make a request. So if you request the records under PRIA, that means send in the -11 or 11A, you can really expect the records to come back to you the way you have for years, you know, just like, you know, outside of PRD, right? That's one method. But several operators that we've heard from have instead opted to go ahead and essentially report early, push those records into PRD ahead of time, as a way to allow you to have access to them. Okay, so to kind of rephrase that, if you send someone a -11 or 11A, you can either expect the records to show up the way they always have, right? They might fax them to you, or they might email them to you, or whatever method that you guys agree on. Or the operator may push ahead the reporting date for themselves and go ahead and get that pilot's records in PRD, you know, kind of initiated by your request, if that makes sense. And then they can reply to you and they can say, hey, the records are in PRD. We've just uploaded them all. And then you would have to go to PRD and pull those records down. Okay, so that's a couple of different ways that they can do that. And, you know, some of the operators like to do that because they know they have to report these records anyway. And it kind of makes sense just to push them ahead if there's a request for the records. But you may find other companies that say, well, you know, we have until 2024 to report these records, and we're not going to do that. We're just going to send them old school, right? So just a reminder again that PRIA and use of the 8060-11 sunsets in September 24. I'm going to say that a lot in this presentation because there's a few points I'm really trying to drive home. Okay, so let's talk about the PAC group. I mentioned it earlier. So the PAC group, I'll define them in a second. They're allowed to not report records on this set schedule that generally applies to everybody else, you know, and they have to report new records if they get a PRD request. Okay, and the PAC group is those conducting public aircraft operations. You can think like sheriff's departments, you know, folks like that. Air tour operators are in the same bucket, and then also corporate operators are in the same group. So these folks normally, or let me say originally, when Part 111 was being drafted, these folks had the same reporting deadlines as everybody else, and that means new records within 30 days, historical records, if applicable, uploaded by certain dates. And we got a lot of feedback from industry that they said, look, especially think about corporate operators, like, we tend to keep our people. They don't leave us very often. So you're making us report all these records and no one's ever going to see them. And so the agency said, it's a good point. So these folks have a choice. They can either report the records on schedule with everyone else, or they can just hold on to them and wait for a request. And that's really the whole point of the request records function in PRD, is so that if you think in the future, in 2026, for example, these corporate folks, they're holding on to pilot records, but they haven't sent them to PRD yet. And it's via the PRD system that you'll notify them that, hey, we are going to hire this person and we need to see their records. So anyway, that's the PAC group. And so, as I've sort of already said a couple of times now, so you'll need to keep requesting records from these folks well into the future, just as the situation comes up for your particular new hires. Okay, we do think it'll be pretty limited. Most of the hiring that goes on between, reviewing entities is happening between 135 operators and 121s, and those folks are loading records all the time. They don't have the choice to hold on to it. So I tried to do a visual depiction of some of this. I'm a visual person, and maybe some of you are. So hopefully this will help more than it hurts. But let's talk about how this looks visually right now during the transition period. So here's the pilot that you wish to hire. And let's imagine that this pilot has 3 different previous employers. They have a 121 employer, and they have a Part 135 employer, and they also have an employer that is inside this PAC group. So it could be a corporate group, it could be Air Tour. Okay, but let's say they have these, and this blue box here under each employer name, that represents all of the records possible that they have for that particular pilot. So of course all these folks have records, and that represents the container for all the records. So the thing I want to point out is, as of right now, like, see, this blue bar may indicate, this is just hypothetical, but this indicates how many of these pilot records are in PRD today. And you can see in this example, it's really not very many. It's maybe a quarter of the pilot records are in PRD. And this is pretty common because companies will start to report records. They report some of them, but they don't finish because it takes time. So, which means this entire other gray bar, these are all records that are not yet in PRD. So, and that's today. That's kind of the status of today. And here's employer B, might have something similar. They've reported a few more records, but there's still a lot of records not yet in the system. And then if we look at the PAC operator, they haven't reported anything to PRD because they have that choice. There's of course exceptions. There's always exceptions, but generally speaking, so the question becomes, how do you get those records, the records that are not yet in PRD? Because you're still going to have to check PRD. So you'll still get to see the records that have been reported, but we want to make sure that you also get to see the ones not yet in PRD. And the answer is the 8060-11/11A, right? That's the way that you get those records. So that's why I keep emphasizing the importance of still using the 8060-11 and 11A. And then how do you get the records from the PAC operator, the other employer there? Well, this one's you have a couple of different choices, but really the easy answer is you still send them the 8060-11, 11A, and then you can also send them a PRD request. You can sort of do both. And I'm going to show you in the demo here in just a second that you can actually do the PRD process for the top 2 as well. You might find that you like to do that because it's just super easy. And you might find from a company perspective, from a bookkeeping perspective, that it's really easiest right now during the transition just to plan on doing the 8060-11 and going to PRD and requesting records there as well, just to cover all your bases. you might find that's the easiest way to handle it. Okay. Now, I want to compare this a little bit with how it's going to look after September 2024. And it's easier is the good news. It's much cleaner. So you have the same pilot, you have the same previous employers, and now you'll see that all of the records are in PRD for the 121 operator. And the same applies to the 135 operator. All the records are there. We say that, of course, because that's the requirement of Part 111. Reality may differ a little bit, but just for conversation's sake, we'll just assume that Part 111 is the standard. So now that still leaves us with the PAC operator who has not reported records because they're not required to do so. They're, for a lot of cases, they can just hold on to them. So you don't have the 806011 anymore after the transition, but you still have the PRD request process. So really that's the answer for the PAC group is after the transition, you'll use the request function for them. So I hope the takeaway here is that even though I know this seems complicated and a bit confusing, come September 2024, things will get much simpler. And you will generally only need the request function for those PAC operators. Everyone else should already have current records, but I'm going to show you how to tell in PRD if the records are current, if they're up to date, because we do have some indicators for that as well. So, so just to kind of reiterate, during the transition period, which is like right now, only the PAC group is obligated to respond to a record request via PRD. And that's kind of an important point, So, so if you send a record request to, say, a 121 operator or a 135 operator, they may respond to it, or they may not, because technically PRIA is still guiding them as to when to report records. So, from a regulatory perspective. So that's kind of what that's explaining. So if you send a PRD request to a non-PAC operator and they don't respond within 14 days, because generally if you send a PRD request, they're supposed to respond within 14 days. But if you send one to, let's say, a 135 operator and you don't get a response in 14 days, then you've already sent the -11. So it's going to get covered. You're going to get the records. It just may be 30 days, right? Because that was the PRIA timeline. So. Okay, so we're going to change gears a little bit. I want to help you see, well, when is it that I need to request records via the PRD system? In other words, how can I tell by looking at the records in PRD if the records are up to date? That's kind of the question. And, we're assuming that for all of this discussion, you're going to send a -11 and 11A, or, regardless. I've kind of already run that home to you. That's just the safest way to do it. It covers all your bases. So go ahead and send that 11 and 11A. But this discussion may be even more useful if we're thinking ahead, if we're thinking about after the transition. So I'm going to show you how that works. So there is a way to tell when you're looking at the PRD record if you need to, well, even before then, there's a way to tell if there are records missing, okay, is a way to think of it, right? Or perhaps there's records missing. So I'm going to show you that. So you do have to have a very specific user role to be able to do this. I've written down here the 4 different user roles that have this ability. Basically, if you're able to review pilot records in PRD, then you're able to do this process, okay? So if you have a different role in PRD that doesn't involve reviewing pilot records, then you won't be able to do this function, okay? So let's go through kind of, we're going to go through the scenario, kind of how it works. So there are 2 general conditions that would make you need to request records using the PRD function. And both of them you can identify when you're looking at records, and we'll go through both of them. So the first thing is, this one sort of makes sense, right? If the pilot tells you they used to work for ABC Airlines, and they tell you this because it's in a resume, or they tell you this because they wrote it in their employment history in PRD. If they tell you they flew for ABC Airlines, and you look in the records for that pilot in PRD, and there are no records from ABC Airlines, it's pretty obvious that PRD has not been updated, So that one's really pretty easy to pick that one out, to identify that, okay, well, they used to work with this company, but this company has not reported any records. And remember, during the transition, like right now, this is going to be more common because a lot of these reporting companies have until maybe June next year or even September the following year to get this done. So you're going to see this a lot probably as you start here. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is when the pilot says that they used to work for ABC Airlines, and you look in PRD and you see some records by ABC Airlines. But what's a little bit tricky is you might say, well, yeah, I see some records, but I don't know if they're up to date, like, have they entered the records, from the past, 30 days or whatever, right? So I'm going to show you how to get a signal on that as well. So, but the response is the same. If you look at these and you go, you know what, I think I need to ask for records, then the actual process is super simple, which is good because this is a lengthy discussion of the policy around it. So I'm glad that at least that part's pretty easy. All right, so let's go through the screenshots and kind of see how this works on the website. So maybe this will kind of help make more sense. So this starts by looking up the pilot records. So the pilot has already given you consent. That has to happen, right? So you go to prd.fa.gov and you, of course, search by the pilot certificate number and then by either their first or the last name. And you hit the search button and you're looking for a record to come back that says, yep, we found that pilot. Now I'm going to take this opportunity because it's a common question. People often ask us if they cannot find a search, like the pilot isn't found when they do this search. And the message used to say no records found. I think the message has been changed to this new one on screen here. We changed it so it would be a little bit more clear what was happening. But what this means, if you see this message, it doesn't mean there's no records for the pilot. There will always be pilot records. So, but what it means is the system doesn't have an active consent for your company. Like maybe the pilot gave you consent and then maybe the pilot revoked it, or maybe it expired, or perhaps you typed in the wrong name, the wrong certificate number, right? There's a few reasons that you won't get a match. But the real important thing I want to stress is that because you don't get a match, that doesn't mean you're done. You go, oh, well, I checked PRD, we're good. Okay, that's not it at all. Okay, a pilot will always have records, so it's important to figure out why the search isn't coming up. So I have a note here that until you're able to actually pull the records in PRD, then you have not yet satisfied Part 111 requirements that you look at records before assigning that pilot to flight duties. So, anyway, that's the important point there. But let's presume that you found the pilot. Okay, this is what it looks like if you have a successful search. It'll find a pilot that matches, and then you just have to add that person to the cart. Those of you that have been doing this for a little while, you may say, yeah, we got this part. It's easy. You just check the checkbox next to their name and you say add to cart. And then it adds them to what we call the shopping cart. And you can keep adding, you can search for other people. If you have a big list of pilots, you can keep searching and just adding them to cart. You can just fill the cart up, right, as you need to. So once you get that done, now this is an important difference where you may have been doing it a bit differently. So what you need to do at this point is you need to use the view button, which is over on the right-hand side. I'm going to show it to you here in a second. You need to view the records on the web page because that's the only way that you can request outstanding records is from the website. If you go straight to downloading the PAR, then you're looking at a PDF file, right? And you can't request records from the PDF file. So my suggestion is at this point, don't download the PAR and click the view button instead. Okay, so click the view button, and then that's going to open the pilot's records on screen in the website. So, and maybe some of you have done it that way anyway, but anyway, so this is the page that you'll see when you arrive. You'll notice that this is basically just, it starts off with the pilot's address and their FAA pilot certificates and things. So to go look at the pilot's history, at their employment history, which is where this happens, you have to click on the Experience tab on the menu bar. And when it opens, it will open in the employment history screen. So this screen that opens has two really important tables in it. The first table is employers reported by the pilot. And as you may or may not know, when pilots grant you consent to see their records, they are required by Part 111 to list in PRD the previous employers. They don't give a lot of details, like they don't give when they started and when they left. It just basically is a name listing, essentially. Okay, so they list the names, and they're required to do that by Part 111. You may find that some pilots, because it's new, right? This process is new to them. They might not be aware that they're required to do that. So if you happen to notice that, if you look at a PAR like this, for example, and you see there's no records, there's no employment history by the pilot, well, then you might want to tell them, hey, you need to go add your employment history and then release that record to us again. Anyway, but let's just presume that they've reported their history here. You may also have a resume, right? They may have given you a paper resume, and you can use that as well for this process, but it should be here as well. Anyway, if you scroll down in the page, there is another table called employment history. Now, this table is different than the one above it because this one is showing you companies that have actually reported to PRD that they employed that pilot. So these are companies that have come to PRD and reported one or more pilot records. Okay, so that's super useful as well. It sort of gives you an initial launch as to places where this pilot used to work. And, this is also super interesting, right? If the pilot tells you they worked at 3 places in the last 5 years, and then you come look at PRD and you find they actually worked at 4, that could be really interesting. Okay, but that's the sort of stuff that PRD allows you to see, by having this system. So, okay, so I want to tell you how to figure out. Let me back up just a sec. So all these employers here in this employment history, I'm going to show you now, how do you figure out, are they current? Are they up to date? Like you see the first company there is called Royal Air Freight. Has Royal Air uploaded all the records to PRD? Because you need to know that. And this is especially hard during the transition. During the transitions, there's going to be a whole lot of no's they haven't because they have time to do it. But as we get past the transition, you should see a lot more yeses, a lot more, yes, the records are current. But that's the question, is how can you tell? So I'm going to go into that now and show you how to figure that out, okay? Because there's 2 indicators that will tell you that. So the first one is pretty straightforward. I already kind of mentioned it. Have all the employers that the pilot listed in their own employment history, have they reported records? And I'll give you an example. Okay, so we're looking back again at the employment history. The top table, I show you just a little bit of it. That's where the pilot said they used to work. And then the bottom section there, where it says employment history, those are companies that have actually submitted records. So this part, it's not horribly technical. You just use your eyes and you see, okay, well, here's test applicant 135C, this company. It's obviously a fake company. Okay, but you have this company and you look to see, well, did they report any records? And if you look through this list and you don't see them, then that tells you, no, they have not reported any records. So that's kind of the first really strong signal that you should request records. And when I say request records, I mean within the PRD system. Remember, we're assuming you have already sent these people a -11 and 11A, right? Because we're doing that during the transition to make sure we don't miss anything. So, so that's the first step. You just look and you say, well, I don't see it there. So I'm going to go ahead and request records from this test applicant company. It's super easy to do. So if the screenshot shows just under that table, there's this button that says request records from a different employer. And so all you have to do is you click that button and then you type in the box that opens the test applicant 135C. It'll make a drop down list. You know how PRD does for companies. And you just pick the correct company and then you click save, and that's all there is to it. So it's literally, you just type in the name of the company and you hit save, and that will generate a request for records to that company. So it's uber easy in that perspective. Once you do that, you'll get this table will be added to the page. And this is where you can keep track of all the companies that you had to request records. So you can see here, it lists off the company and it lists off the expiration date. That's got there's a 14-day expiration date because that's the expectation, is that pack operators will respond within 14 days. And that's how you can keep track of it, because you can come back to this in a few days. I generally suggest just wait 14 days, unless you're just really bored. You probably don't want to be checking this airman's record every day. So I suggest you just come back in 14 days and see if there's any updates. The system does send emails and things, but it may be hard to, maybe you don't get the right email or whatever. So that's how you check the status. So I make a note here that pack operators will respond within 14 days because that's their requirement per Part 111. And then the other operators, they may respond to this request, or they may instead wait for that -11 and 11A. So it's a good thing you already sent it, right? Preemptively, you sent that 11A out there. So that's the first condition. That one's pretty clear cut. If you see them, if there's a company on the resume that's not shown in the employment history from PRD, like the record list, then that means that company hasn't provided any records. So the second condition is a little bit trickier, and really it's just because the company has reported some records. And so now you sort of need to ask yourself, well, okay, they did report records, but are they up to date? And the system will try to help you figure that out. So I'm going to kind of show you how that works as well. So let's look at at how you do that. So there's two indicators. There's two columns that we're going to look at again. One of them is the PRD records complete date, and the other is the no additional records to report. And they have different meanings. But I think if we explain it a little bit, it'll make some sense to you, kind of how that works. So let's first look at the PRD records complete date. Again, we're looking at the employment history table. This is the one you were just looking at a second ago. So there's this column. It says PRD records complete date. So what this date means, if it's present, you see in this example, it's missing. Okay. But if there's a date there, it means that was the last time the operator has, I guess you can say, stated that all of the records are in PRD and up to date for that pilot. But they may have done that in January, right? And then not reported records since. They might have been busy and just didn't get any more in there. But there very well could be records since then. So generally we say if this date is present, then you want it to be within about 30 days. If it's older than 30 days, then you should just go ahead and request records using the function here. If you look at this PRD records complete date and it was yesterday, that indicates to you that just yesterday, the company uploaded all the records into PRD. So there's really, the odds of there being something else to report are really slim. It's possible, I suppose, right? But that's kind of what that's for, that records complete date. So you can use that to sort of get an indicator, has the company ever had everything up to date, and how long ago did they do it? Okay, so that's what that one signals. And then the other one to look at is this other column right next to it. And it says no additional records to report. This one is easier, I think, in my opinion, because what this one means is that the previous employer is telling you on this date, we uploaded all of the pilot records. They're current, they're complete, and the pilot no longer works here. That's real important because that means you kind of don't care how old that date is. You know, that date could be 2 years old and you don't care, you know, because if the company enters that date, then they're telling us, they're signaling to you that I've updated PRD, it's got all the records, and there's no more records expected because they don't work for us anymore. Okay, so that's a really a nice signal. If that date is present, then you can feel really comfortable that PRD is current and up to date. You know, you're not going to see a lot of that right now, right? Because we're in the transition period, but I would expect after September 2024, this should be kind of the norm, you know, where people have worked for companies, then left, moved on to other jobs. So so we kind of, I have some text there that basically repeats what I just said. So if there's a date there, everything's up to date. You don't need to request records. But let's look at sort of a bigger picture and kind of look at some of these. So this is the same pilot, and I just want to look at these a little bit, sort of like an example. So you'll notice that this company, this is called Halo Flight. Halo Flight used to employ this pilot, and they have provided records to PRD. We know that because they show up in this list. Okay. And they do have a date reported of September 30, 2019. They have a date in that column that says no additional records to report. So what that tells you is all the records from Halo Flight are current, complete, up to date. You don't need to ask for any more records. Now, you may have already sent them a -11, and that's fine. It's absolutely fine that you did that during the transition. If we're talking after the transition, you wouldn't have sent to -11 because it's no longer in play. And this indicates to you that you don't have to mess with them. Their PRDs current, and you can know that the records you find there are all the records that you're supposed to find. And you can see that applies for many of these operators. There's about 4 of them that have that. So all those are up to date, which is great. Now looking at Royal Air Freight as an example, you'll see that they don't have, there's not a date in either column, right? Neither column has a date. So this tells you that while they have clearly reported something to PRD because they even show up in the list, you can just assume that the records are not current and you'll want to request any outstanding records. So you've already sent them a -11 because that's what we've been trying to remind you to do. So you'll already get records from that angle, but I would go ahead and hit the request outstanding records button because it's so easy and it's so quick, and it'll just kind of double check, make sure that you get those records. Okay. So when you push that button that says request outstanding records, you don't even have to fill a form in. It's just, you get a confirmation message and that's it. Okay. And now you'll see that where it used to have the button that you could press, now it says requested. And that way, you know that, you know, the PRD system has your request, and the request has gone to Royal Air Freight in this example. And Royal Air Freight will be notified by email and that sort of thing. Okay. So they have a way to tell. And once they process it, I think I have an example in here. Well, I'll show you an example in a second. I better not miss these points. So, and then I say, you know, repeat that process for any other employers that you see on there. You know, you might find the easiest approach here is if that column, anybody in that column that has that blue button, like Zulu Mike and Home Tonight Aviation, you might just want to hit the button, right? Because if they don't have any more records, they'll tell you. If they have records, they'll add them. You see what I'm saying? So even though you've already sent them a -11, so let me go back to my other note here. So the previous employers will be notified by a request via email and their PRD inbox. I suggest you check back within 14 days to see what records have shown up. I say 14 days because that's the regulatory requirement for PAC operators. Remember the non-PAC people, they may just wait for your -11 to respond. So that's why we did that, preemptively. If you don't get a response after 14 days, expect the records from the -11, 11A. Except if this is a PAC operator, let us know, because the PAC folks, and I know sometimes it's hard to tell. I get that it's hard for you to know what kind of operator this is. But if you happen to know that this is a corporate operator, or it's an air tour company and they're not responding to your request, contact PRD support, because we can kind of figure out why, did they not get the email? What's up, right? We can help them troubleshoot that. Okay, so here's where it will indicate, let's say this is a few days later, right? Maybe 7 days later, they go in and they process your request. This is Royal Air Freight in this example. And they can indicate that they've completed your request for records. That doesn't mean they added records, because maybe there weren't any to add. But that's sort of on the next page of the discussion, but you can see it there. And if you click where it says completed, you will get a little bit more information. You'll get the name of who completed the task, and they'll even indicate how they responded. Like it'll say, records reported to PRD, or they might say, it depends on the situation. They might say records were emailed. They might make comments about it, but that's kind of what that does for you. All right, so we're almost done. There's just a really couple important points to make here. So if a previous employer does add records because you asked them to, okay, which is great, it's really important to keep in mind that you will not see the new records until the pilot grants a fresh consent to you. You might remember that when a pilot grants consent, it's a snapshot in time of what records existed at that moment, right? So if new records arrive in the system, you're not going to see that difference until the pilot gives you a fresh consent. So it's just a real important point to make, that after 14 days, you can go in there and you can look and see if those requests have been responded to or not, but you still won't see the new records. If, like, let's say you go over to the training section, you won't see any new records. You won't notice any difference. Okay. And that's because the pilot needs to give you a fresh consent. So you just got to remember and tell them, part of your process, after new records have been provided, you say, hey, pilot, I need you to give me a fresh consent because I need to see what changes are in there. Okay. And then you'll get to see them. Okay. So generally speaking, outstanding pilot records are added within 14 days. That's kind of the rule of thumb. And even, I've already said this, even if they didn't add new records, they should still indicate that they processed your request, and they might have in the comment section, no records to add, something of that sort. Okay. And again, you can view the pilot records after 14 days to see if the status changes to complete. That's kind of how you want to do that. And then I've already said this, but I just wanted to reiterate it. Really important. Got to get that fresh consent. Okay. So get the fresh consent so you can see all the records. Okay. All right. We are literally pretty much on the last slide. I mentioned this because it was a good opportunity, because we have your attention. You're all here. So I wanted to bring this one up. We get a lot of questions around drug and alcohol records related to PRD and the 8060-12. And so I wanted just to kind of reiterate this, that while Part 111 does have you report certain drug and alcohol records into PRD, that doesn't have anything to do with and doesn't change anything about Part 40. CFR Part 40 is a different requirement that a lot of DOT entities have to exchange these drug and alcohol records, right? And nothing about that changes. That exchange and the way that you do that, the way you've done that for years, that is not changing just because we have PRD here. You still have to do that process. You still have to use the -12 right now to exchange those records. And additionally, you are still reporting some of those records to PRD, right? So, so as a hiring employer, you're sort of getting a little extra opportunity to get to see some of these key records, because you're going to see some of them in PRD, and you're still going to request all of them, all the records, via Part 40, okay, via the -12. So these are really separate processes. And if you're wondering, well, what happens in September 2024 when PREA goes away, there is going to be a new form. I think you can actually use it today. But the people that you need to ask about those sorts of changes is not the PRD team, because this has only got to do with Part 40 and the drug and alcohol regulations, which is not what we do. So I have the email address down here at the bottom of this slide, so that if you have questions around drug and alcohol, record reporting, direct it to them, except for if your question is about reporting certain drug and alcohol records to PRD under Part 111, we can help with that. But I just hope this helps. Make it real distinctly clear in your mind that exchanging these drug and alcohol records under Part 40 is a completely separate requirement, a completely separate process. I know that they got blended with PREA, and so that makes it confusing, because we're telling you PREA is going away, and which is true, but Part 40 is not going away. So we got to still comply with that part of it. So I hope I didn't generate more questions with that slide, but I just wanted to throw that in there since I have your attention. So let's kind of wrap it up. I know we're practically out of time here. So in summary, real important, keep sending those 8060-1111As to all previous employers. Like I said at the top of the presentation, I'm not speaking to the 12s or the 13s, those other forms. This is just about the 1111A. So keep sending those forms until we get to the transition, which is September 2024. And then at that time, the 1111A goes away, and you shouldn't need to do that anymore. Everything should be in PRD. And if you do find yourself in those cases where you need to request records, you would use the function and PRD. So, and like I already said, we really think that this whole process of requesting records come September 2024 will be pretty limited, because it should primarily just exist for those pack operators. If you're a new hire, happen to work for a corporate operator or an air tour or someone conducting public aircraft operations, then you may have to push the button. But otherwise, I don't expect you'll have to mess with the button much. Okay. So I think that's it. The next webinar is October the 20th, and it is the flip side of this discussion. Okay, this discussion was about the hiring employer figuring out how to request records in this complicated world of Part 111 and PREA. The next webinar is going to be for the previous employer, and so they can sort of be clear how to respond to these requests. If the request is a -11 or the request comes in through PRD, we'll go over that process. Okay, so if you are a contributor for your company, you may want to mark that one down. It could be really useful to you. So we do have just maybe a couple of seconds, a couple minutes left. I don't know, Stacy, are there maybe a couple of questions that you think might be valuable to a lot of folks that we can try and cover?
Hi, Chris. Let's see. I'm going through the questions, and there are a lot of questions about the clarifications about. Let's see. I'm trying to pick just one from
No.
here, but
I see an easy one, Stacy.
Oh.
I might just grab it.
Okay, please feel free to do.
I'm gonna grab one. So this is from a fellow named Steve asked what the difference is between the dash 11, 11A and the 10 and 10A. And it's a pretty good question, but it should be pretty easy to answer at the same time. So the 11 and 11A, those two forms are used under PREA to request pilot records from previous employers. That's what they're used for. The 10, 8060-10 and 10A used to be used to request pilot records from the FAA. So that's what employers would send to us, and we would generate a report and we would provide back a response that said the pilot holds these certificates, has this accident history, has this enforcement history. But in December of 21, we discontinued use of the dash 10 and 10A because Part 111 required that folks start using PRD for that, right? So ever since December 2021, our office has not processed dash 10s. And because hiring employers are required to go to PRD and get that information. So I hope that helps with that one. We have maybe time for one more, Stacy, if you happen to find one while I was chatting.
Okay, yes, I think this one should be a pretty a quick, easy one to answer. It's from Brenda. We have a third-party administrator requesting records via the 8060-11 11A. We uploaded the records into PRD and advised them records are available there. Does that satisfy the request once they are advised records are in PRD?
Yes, great question. And yes, it's our position that it does. If you have reported the records into PRD and they're current and up to date, then the requesting employer can now go in through PRD and pull those records. So it's obviously important, as I've mentioned, that the hiring employer is going to need to get a fresh consent to see those new records. But that's exactly the process. It might be super handy for those of you that like to respond that way, that you like to push ahead the reporting and then respond to the PREA request by saying the records are in PRD, you can get them there. It might be super great if you reminded them, don't forget to get a fresh consent from the pilot or they won't see it. All right. But yeah, that's a great question. And it's coming up really common. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about at the next webinar on, I think I said October 20. I think that's what I said. Yeah, October 20. So I think we better stop there with our time. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. And I know this was a ton of information. Please do go ahead and finish submitting questions and we'll get them in a report. And then in the next couple of weeks, as time allows for us, we will respond back to your emails. If you if you have a more urgent pressing question, of course, you can always email prd support@faa.gov and we'll help you out. So I think we're going to close it there. So thank you all for attending. I hope you found it useful. Thanks. Bye-bye.